Islam started out as a peaceful religion. However, Muhammad and his followers were attacked, persecuted, and driven out of their homes and their property taken. He and his followers fought back against his persecutors, stopped preaching peace, and raided traders and built up the resources to conquer their persecutors, then expanded to build an empire for both defense and retribution when they were still weak. Near his death, he supposedly began preaching peace again, and even pardoned many lower-level persecutors. Upon his death, his followers split between Sunnis and Shia, who fought, persecuted, and killed each other. The Sunnis ran the caliphate, and thanks to the Quran, Muslims could not enslave other Muslims, which was sort of a step up from what the area had been before, but it encouraged them to go out and enslave non-Muslims, which expanded the caliphate through violence and started a slave trade from Africa to India. A more Persian Abbasid secular government took over the caliphate, who were intensely interested in astrology and learning and thinking and progress exploded. The Baghdad library collected massive books from every corner of the world that their trade would reach. They synchronized Greek and Indian math, creating algebra. They advanced medicine, creating hospitals, while Europe was taking time recovering from the knowledge they had lost when throwing out the works of old pagan philosophers. Sufi Islam, a mystical spiritual religion, was born a half-century prior, with ideas of peace, ideas much closer to Buddhism than the legalistic fear-based Quran. Sufis ended up spreading their religion of peace to the majority of the modern Muslim world, from the non-Mediterranean North Africa to all the way to Indonesia. The religion of peace spread so much better than what was ever spread through the sword, and still venerated the Quran. Just like any empire, they tried to expand their borders, but more for politics and power than before. Muslims in the Caliphate still viewed Muslim superiority, and the Barbary pirates attacked all Western vessels, which the U.S. ended up defeating and signing a treaty with. The Ottomans rose up later and returned to more violent empire building, just like their Christian neighbors around them. They became weakened over time by growing nationalism in their territories wanting their own nations, such as the Armenians and Bulgarians. The reforms were too slow and started losing out technologically with the West, much of it due to enforced low literacy rates, and created a constitution and democracy in the early 1900s. At the same time, Islamism was a backlash to the rapid yet too slow changes in the self-declared caliphate, making the claims that the reason why we were losing was not for technological reasons, but because they were not following the word of Muhammad and his style of ruling. They looked at the Western style of colonialism and saw it as brutal and barbaric, which, to be honest, it actually was. The British helped Ibn Saud, a radical Wahhabist, take Arabia and became king. The Ottomans slaughtered the Christian Armenians with systematic violence that it was the first time the word genocide was coined during and after World War I to prevent them from fighting with the British for their own state too. The Ottoman Empire was split up, creating a Middle East we have today. Islamism had even more influence from Nazi ideas of radical superiority, especially against Jews. Wealthy people in the Saudi government began spreading propaganda to the Islamic world in both the Caliphate spread areas and the Sufi spread areas. Their ideas spread better in Caliph areas, but they began to also take hold in Sufi spread areas, especially in areas disgruntled with the West thanks to colonization and Cold War proxy wars. Christianity started off as a religion of peace. Jesus of Nazareth preached a message of love your enemy and turn the other cheek, and equality for slaves and free men and women while continuing to follow the Jewish law. Paul later came along and overturned a lot of what Jesus said with his own supposed divine revelation, and certain sects failed to notice. At the time of Constantine, there were 13 to 14 sects of Christianity, each with some very radical differing beliefs. Some believing Jesus was just a man, some that he was a god that never came down to man, some that he was a spiritual being that we can all aspire to be. Constantine converted to Christianity and brought together several branches that agreed to participate in the Council of Nicaea, where they were basically voted on what everyone had to believe. 50 years later, Theodosius declared Nicene Catholic Christianity to be the state religion, establishing the concept of the Trinity and persecuting and criminalizing all other kinds of Christians, along with pagans. This became a common practice until the fall of the Roman Empire, which was replaced by the Holy Roman Empire. The Germanic, Gallic, Gaelic, Slavic, and Viking chieftains and kings gained prestige and backing by converting to Catholicism and forcefully converting their people in their nation through persecution and slaughter, which translated most often into military backing against their pagan enemies. This practice of converting for leverage and backing spread through most of Europe, ensuring rulers would gain the upper hand over their long feuds if they found Jesus. The empire was becoming more secular over time and the Pope losing power, so he called for a great crusade against the Sassanid Muslims who held Jerusalem, which led to some horrible atrocities, failed missions, and exploitation of children, many of whom were sold into slavery, never really doing much to actually stop the empire expansion of the Muslim Empire. When the knights came back from the Crusades, many brought a lot of wealth, but a lot of blood was on their hands and started paying monks to pray them into heaven. That made the clergy very rich and powerful to the point that the Pope began selling papal indulgences to allow people to sin with no spiritual consequences. This infuriated one monk named Martin Luther, who spoke out against the church and printed the first Bible in German instead of Latin so the commoners could read it. Once read, many protested against Rome, causing violent and bloody revolution against the Catholic Church. More translations were created and more Protestant denominations sprang up, many switching loyalty, and Catholics and Protestants were persecuted and slaughtered in both competing nations, much like the Sunnis and Shias of old. America was discovered, and both the Catholics and Protestants, viewing their religions as superior to those heathen savages, ended up enslaving and slaughtering those people in the name of God. Though Western disease did most of the heavy lifting, which was really no one's fault, unless you count the smallpox blanket trick. Conquistadors would read proclamations in Spanish to native peoples telling them to convert as brothers or die and become slaves. The natives, of course, not understanding Spanish or the Bible at all, often ended up tossing the Bible aside given to them, which led to brutal massacres. Catholic missionaries in California created Native American slaves to make them good Catholics and treated them terribly when they reverted to their native lifestyles, which was significantly better. Protestant England did much the same to their natives, with one tribe or another taking their land and reneging on their promises constantly. They also realized that native peoples made lousy slaves as they had little resistance to malaria, as it was new to them, and found African slaves did much better, taking these inferior heathens to work in the New World and convert them. The African slave trade was rationalized with the Bible, but also fought against, using theology as well. Catholics and Protestants continue to fight each other in Europe for both political and religious reasons, and when technology advanced, they began carving up the world and colonizing inferior native non-Christian lands to exploit their resources. The newly formed United States, during a period of low religious belief, established the First Amendment for both ideological and practical reasons, as there were so many branches of Christianity, and cohesion of the Union was essential to defend itself. America continues to fluctuate between very religious and not so religious, as following the death of the founders, the next generation had the Great Awakening, and with it came Manifest Destiny, and the belief that God had promised the American continent to them, and basically went about trying to wipe out the native people's culture, including killing off millions of bison, so they would starve or take up a civilized Western lifestyle. We continue to break treaties with them to the point that they now trust Christians as far as they can throw them, living on the worst land, and we expect them to pull themselves up. The U.S. had a war that ultimately freed the slaves, but rationalization of religion blended with newfound evolution treated the blacks as inferior and rationalized them as being the descendants of Ham, creating the rise of the KKK and Jim Crow. The US, Canada, and Australia in general saw every aspect non-Christian indigenous life as barbaric and a blight on the nations, not to mention they were on the Christians' God-given land and openly and proudly declared cultural genocide in the name of Christian progress. Forcefully removing children from parents, cutting off their hair, beating them if they used anything but English, and forced them to study the Bible and claim Christianity, with serious long-term psychological impact, all in the name of making them good, useful Christian citizens. And we're not even going to discuss the sexual abuse. King Leopold took the Christian superiority over Africans to such a radical extreme level that he ran the Congo as his own personal concentration camp. Britain got China hooked on super cheap opium, destroying their long-held empire. Europe continued to have wars and colonizations in the name of God to the point that they had such an arms race and hair trigger that just one minor archduke getting assassinated threw the entirety of Europe into a bloodbath, along with many other parts of the world owned by Europe. Post-World War I desperation drove Germany to elect a Jewish-hating group. Their Catholics had a long-term hatred of Jews at the time, which he played on quite nicely and used brutal tactics to become a totalitarian dictator. At the same time in the US, the KKK resurfaced in the North with a Protestant hatred of Catholics. Large anti-union companies realized how trusted pastors were and found shills to preach a version of the capitalist prosperity gospel, over time making Jesus synonymous in the American minds with America and capitalism. I'm doing pre-World War II. There is too much to list, but anyone who claims that Islam was spread by the edge of the sword really doesn't know the horrible history of Christianity. If you try to say they weren't real Christians, we can easily say that the terrorists aren't real Muslims. A little under 2/3 of all modern Muslims' ancestors were converted by threat of the sword. a little over 2/3 of all modern Christians' ancestors were spread by the thread of the sword. You can't claim Islam was spread by the sword, then ignore Christianity. Hey there, thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked what you saw from my channel, please subscribe and donate to my Patreon. If you have evidence to counter what I say, please provide it. If you would like to see what I was doing with this channel 6 years ago, please click the links on the screen. Thank you so much.